I'm saying that you're wrong. And that anyone could take numbers. You could have taken numbers. I saw economists do it in the 2008 crisis to say that things were doing okay, that things were improving, that it was okay. You could take data at any point in time.
Really, dude.
Things are looking good. It's looking okay. I'm saying it's an unmitigated disaster in that we've seen, and it's not just Biden's fault. I also put blame on Republicans and Trump, that because we saw the lockdowns and things like that and the stimulus, we have crushed the middle class and the working class. We've crushed small businesses. We've injected trillions upon trillions of dollars into this economy. We've only seen marginal recovery. We've seen that Biden took place when we had all of these things going so far down that was in a basement, basically, and yet the recovery's been remarkably slow. We've seen that the inflation has grown at levels that we were told that it wouldn't happen, it would be transitionary. We've seen that producer costs have gone to the highest level that we've ever seen. By the way, with the inflation numbers, if you listen to Peter Schiff, he talks about how the CPI that was used for the inflation numbers, if we use the same numbers that we used in the 1980s, we would actually see inflation closer to 15%.
Oh, we did it. We got the meme. We hit the meme. We hit the 1980s inflation meme. Do you think he chat GPT that one too? Do you think he had to search that one up? How can I make my unfalsifiable statement that the economy is bad true? And it came up with actually, if we use the data, we include mortgage rates and fucking CPI, when mortgage rates rise at the same time as interest rates, it actually shows inflation is higher than it is. Yeah, the 1980 CPI was changed for a reason, a very good reason. Prior to 1983, I believe, we were not using owners equivalent rent. What we were doing is looking at both housing prices and the interest payments paid, mortgage rates, the interest payments paid to mortgages. A few reasons you don't want to do that. One, you're somewhat double counting. Like, if we're trying to keep track of the price of washing machines, we don't count the price of the washing machine and then the interest that you pay on the washing machine because you bought it with a credit card. We just don't want to do that. Two, CPI is supposed to measure consumption. Housing, owner-occupied housing, in many ways isn't consumption, but it's also an investment. So instead of, you don't want to track investment, what you want to do is what we do now. We build a metric called owner's equivalent rent, where we basically ask owners, how much would you rent your house for today? And that measures housing, the approximate price of housing, as if it were actually consumed and not used as an investment. Thirdly, you don't want it, so basically we were measuring mortgage rates, right? Mortgage rates tend to increase with the interest rate. Rising interest rates is how you fight inflation. Typically, when we have inflationary periods, the Fed increases the federal funds rate, and that slows down the economy, and it combats inflation, in theory, at least. It's accepted by most people, but the including mortgage rates in the CPI was the big issue, because every single time you raised interest rates, you would also increase the mortgage rate, and therefore mechanistically increase inflation. You don't want a result of raising the interest rate to be included in inflation, because raising interest rates is how you fight inflation. There's obviously an issue there. On top of the two issues I already cited, there's very good reasons that we switched. It was not a malicious switch. It is not good to use 1983 CPI methodology to try to measure inflation today and say, oh, actually, if we double count housing prices and measure investment, and it's actually higher, and my unfalsifiable statement about the economy being bad suddenly becomes true. No, it's so dumb.
Which would be the actual number that we'd be looking at. So because the way we measure these things has changed over time, we're able to say, oh, actually things don't look, we measure things in this way, we measure things in that way. For example, I have some questions about the weekly earnings chart that you said. Does that weekly earnings chart average to a 40-hour work week? Or could it be that people's usual weekly earnings in this decile are actually increased because they're working more hours?
Come on, dude. You wouldn't trust it either way. You just say it's manipulated.
I believe they standardize the number of. Typically, I think a full-time worker is. I believe by federal standards, a full-time worker is considered.
I gooned and slept. I am still going in ARC.
It's not 40 hours a week. It's below 40 hours a week. I'm pretty sure it's 36 hours a week, but I could be wrong. Actually, it is 36 hours a week. I'm pretty sure.
Because
it wouldn't matter.
It says employed full-time.
Yeah. These are like marginally different metrics. You asked for the exact metric that was cited in that graph, so I just went and found it for you.
But that's so. For example, it is entirely reasonable. I know this because I know people that work in the hospitality industry that went from working 30 hours a week to working 70 hours a week, and they're doing far better economically. But they're forced to do that because they can't find. If I drive through my little town here, all the fast food places have $1,000 signing bonus. Come work $1,000 signing. They all have signs up. Sorry, it'll take a while to get your food. People aren't showing up to work. That's just in my little town. That's occurring all over the place, right? Because the participation in these type of things has declined because we've incentivized people not to come back to work. Now we're told.
Did he not cite the labor? Econoboi linked the labor force participation rate earlier in this debate. It wasn't because people aren't showing up to work. It's because we had a tight labor market. There were a lot of job vacancies because participation was so high that there weren't enough people to hire. That's why wages increased so fast, because they needed to, they wanted to incentivize people. Oh my god. Prime age, labor force participation rate. So we're recorded in December 2021. 82%. It's based. That's almost what it was pre-COVID.
But unemployment's at lows. You know, the labor participation is doing great, and yet we see these things that we never saw in the past, right? So, and then again, like, here's another thing, right? The $120 a month that these people in this group are getting, it doesn't mean that inflation would hit them the same way. So, for example, inflation is a metric that's taking on average all products and things like that. But products that these people would be more likely to purchase, such as gasoline and other food staples, may have gone up more than the average amount of inflation.
No, I mean, at least because inflation is I get what you're saying, but not. I think that narrative actually goes against you if you look into the numbers. Like, I think what you've seen is
79%.
portion of, for instance, a really large portion of the inflation has been an increase in
Oh
cost.
my god, bro, it's like, oh my god, kill me. But I could have turned that clip of me explaining the CPI thing into a YouTube short or something. But it's, can I download a clip on Twitch? How far back can you clip on Twitch? Someone clip that. I need to figure out a way to do that. I could just record it, I guess. It would be inconvenient, but there's a game I gotta play.
A vehicle. Now, it's not that we shouldn't take seriously the idea that vehicles are becoming less affordable, right? It's rather just the idea that, you know, the inability of an American to buy a new car is probably not as big a deal as it would be if, like, food went up by 50% in price, right? And so when you look at those numbers, you tend to find that, you know, things like food or even energy that's getting a lot of coverage, you'll find that the increases in those things has not been, you know, they're not pulling the average inflation up. They tend to pull the average inflation down, at least in this most recent spat of inflation, because the inflation that we're seeing now is not it's not really due to government policy for the most part. It's not that government spending doesn't cause inflation. It can, certainly. And there's certainly a reasonable argument that there's been upward pressure on prices as a result of these, the $5 trillion worth of stimulus. I would never say anything different. But it does seem like that, as I mentioned, like way in the beginning of our talk, it seems that the inflation that we're seeing now is as a result of supply chain shortages that aren't necessarily because of government policy, but rather because of curtailment in production processes.
Gmod was way better. Kids CC flame trash. I play Gmod. I have plenty of time in Gmod.
Coming online slower than demand.
I should play Gmod.
It's supply recovery that's holding the economy back.
I'll load up prop hunt.
That's why that's why they've said that this inflation is transitory, is because the expectation is that as the supply chains come back online, inflation is going to diminish to some extent. And to be fair, also the Fed is going to stop doing their quantitative easing, and they're going to raise rates as well. So inflation is going to be a 2021 problem. I can't imagine that come 2023 we're going to. I don't think this narrative is going to persist into 2023.
And again, I think that we're actually likely to see inflation last longer because I think that.
We did, but part of the reason we did was because people like Rob were saying you should use the pre-1983 methodology, and also all the job data is fake, all the jobs are made up, and also PCE is made up and CPI is made up, and everything is fake. Like,
right, the increase in the money supply that we've seen hasn't really taken into effect in inflation yet. Right? I think that's something that usually is going to take more time, right? So when and that's the amazing thing here. You could make me president, right? And 2024 elect Rob president, and for 4 years we're gonna have a booming economy. Why? I'll just print $50 trillion every year and hand it out to people. Wow, things are looking great. People got a ton of money. Eventually that'll catch up though. It's not gonna come the first year. And so when we see this mass spending spree, that
like. Hold on. Let me just. There's this video misunderstood equation in economics.
While consumption of your country's poor, and activity is often good GDP, private consumption, investment, and government spending, plus net exports. You can remember it because if you squint, you can find your favorite economist's name in it. This seems pretty straightforward. There aren't even any complicated mathematical operations in there. There's no derivatives or integrals, no exponents, there's not even multiplication. How could this be one of the most confusing equations in economics? One problem is that I sort of lied when I gave you the equation. Maybe not a lie, but certainly not the full complicated lie.
Okay, hold on. It goes over the imports and subtracting GDP first, and then he goes over the government spending thing.
Things that are included dates and how different is C with an M GDP that we only did what was an example. I had no clue, except, well, this can was labeled Thai can. Something helpful because as a caveat, there are some arguments you can make that imports do decrease GDP. After focusing so much on that last term, let's look at some confusion over the other three. But to fix ideas, let's start with this one. Another misconception I see revolves around government spending. When we look at this equation, it looks like there's a clear way to increase GDP. Just increase government spending. In fact, since tax revenues increase as GDP increases, you can have the government spend more money, increase GDP. In the future, they can collect more money in taxes and spend more money. GDP will continue to rise. It's like an infinite money hack. I know you know that there was something wrong about what I just said. Let's use a simple supply and demand model to help us understand what it was. When the government spends, it borrows money. That's what the national debt is. So let's look at a model of the market for loanable funds. The demand in this market comes from people and companies who want to finance homes, inventory, or new capital. The supply side of this market comes from people saving their money. They choose not to spend money on consumption today so they can get more consumption in the future. That equilibrium will be the total amount of money both being saved and being lent out. Let's start by saying the government doesn't spend anything. Then that equilibrium quantity is going to be the total amount of investment in the economy, or the I from our equation. Now let's say that the government wants to spend some $100 million. Since the government needs money, it's on the demand side of the market, and it will shift this demand curve to the right by $100 million. The new equilibrium is at the new intersection of supply and demand, and the amount of funds is equal to the sum of both government spending, G, and private investment, I. But we already know the government is borrowing $100 million, which means it takes up this much. Then the rest is the private investment.
To think about how this affects GDP, let's compare this to the world without government spending. Obviously, now we have government spending, so G has gone up. But also notice how the new level of private investment is smaller than the previous level of investment.
Because the government demand caused the interest rate to increase, there were private investors who had to leave the market because they couldn't take the higher interest rate. We call this crowd out.
So investment has gone down.
Well, some might say, sure, the government spending decreased private investment, but we still have more spending than we did before. GDP increased, just not as much as the full government spending. But where is all of this money in savings coming from? Think about the supply curve. The quantity of savings comes from people who sacrifice consumption today for more consumption in the future. If today's savings have increased, that means today's consumption has decreased. That means when government spending increases, it decreases both investment and consumption by exactly the same amount, and the net effect is zero. You can't get more GDP with more government spending. Again, there are some
What?
caveats. This model assumes that there's full employment and no slack in the economy. We could write down
Like you can do the, like, arguably, if there's idle resources, like he's saying, the slack in the economy thing, then, you can bring idle resources into use via stimulus. But, like,
It happens for a ton of money. Eventually, that'll catch up, though. It's not going to come for you and hand it out to people. Wow, things are looking great. People got a ton of money. And that's the amazing thing here. You could make me president, right? And 2024 elect Rob president, and for 4 years, we're going to have a booming economy. Why? I'll just print $50 trillion every year and hand it out to people. Wow, things are looking great. People got a ton of money. Eventually, that'll catch up, though. It's not going to come the first year. And so when we see that,
like, if you, like, literally, you learn this in Econ, like, it's crowding out. Like, you, like, teach crowding out in, like, Econ 101. Like, you crowd out investment and consumption, so you don't, everything doesn't, quote unquote, like, look great. You just get, unless you bring idle resources into use in a time of slump or whatever, which is arguably what Biden and Trump were doing when they were doing stimulus, right?
mass
But, like,
spending spree that happens